It was a quiet Sunday afternoon on May 7th, 2017, in the small town of Bel Air, Ohio, when the ordinary suddenly turned into a nightmare. David Kinney, his wife Sherry, and their young daughter were making what seemed like a simple visit to a close family friend, Brad McGarry. Their plan was straightforward. David needed to return a weed trimmer he had borrowed, but as they arrived at Brad's home, something felt off. The air was heavy with unease, and when they knocked on the front door, no one answered. Worry began to creep in. Brad's car was parked in the driveway, suggesting he should have been home. David led his wife and daughter around to the back of the house, where they found the service door slightly ajar. It was unusual for Brad to leave it that way. David hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. Inside, the house was a mess, drawers half open, furniture disturbed, an unsettling silence hanging in the air. Sherry called out for Brad, but there was no reply. The only sound was the faint creak of the floor beneath their feet. Growing increasingly anxious, David decided to search the house himself. Sherry stayed upstairs with their daughter, while David made his way down to the basement. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. On the cold basement floor lay Brad McGarry, motionless, a dark pool of blood surrounding his head. David froze in disbelief before letting out a scream that brought Sherry running. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw the horrific scene for herself, her husband standing over the lifeless body of their friend. Sherry immediately pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice trembling as she reported what they had found. Within minutes, local police arrived, finding David and Sherry outside the home, shaken and distraught. Both repeated the same story. They had come by to return a weed trimmer, found the door open, and walked in only to discover Brad dead in the basement. They described Brad as a dear friend, more like family than anything else. The Kennys explained that Brad had been part of their lives for years. Their children adored him, affectionately calling him Uncle Brad. They often celebrated holidays together and had even planned a family vacation to the Bahamas later that year, when detectives began questioning them about Brad's personal life. Sherry mentioned that he had recently ended a turbulent relationship with a man named Scotty, though she didn't know his last name. The relationship, she said, had been filled with arguments and drama, and she wondered if it could have something to do with what happened. Investigators entered the home and immediately recognized that something violent had occurred. Brad was found face down with a gunshot wound to the head. At first, some officers speculated that he might have taken his own life, but that theory quickly unraveled when the forensic examiner arrived and asked whether they had found a gun. There wasn't one anywhere near the body. To rule out any possibility, the forensic team carefully rolled the body over. Still, no weapon. Suicide was no longer on the table. What they were looking at was murder. The more they examined the scene, the more confusing it became. The house appeared ransacked, but in a way that didn't make sense for a burglary. The kitchen drawers were open, the living room furniture was out of place, but nothing valuable seemed to be missing. Expensive items were left untouched, including electronics and money that was scattered across the floor. Brad was known to collect rustic artwork, much of which still hung undisturbed on the walls. Detectives began to suspect that the scene had been deliberately staged to look like a robbery. But who would want Brad McGarry dead and why? Brad had worked as a coal miner, a demanding job that often came with tough company. Some detectives wondered if his open sexuality might have caused tension among co-workers, possibly leading to a hate-fueled attack. But when investigators spoke with his colleagues, they were surprised to learn that everyone seemed to genuinely like and respect Brad. He was described as hard-working, friendly, and well-liked. That theory was quickly dismissed. Instead, detectives turned back to the people closest to him, determined to uncover what secrets might lie beneath the surface of his quiet Ohio life. As detectives continued digging into Brad's life, they started with the lead Sherry had given them, the ex-boyfriend named Scotty. Brad's friends confirmed that the relationship had been volatile, full of jealousy and arguments. Hoping to find a clue, officers tracked down Scotty's full name and address, only to discover that he couldn't have been involved at all. Scotty's mother explained that he'd been behind bars for 3 months, serving time for violating his probation. That should have ruled him out completely, but the investigators still wanted to be sure. They visited Scotty in jail to break the news of Brad's death and to watch his reaction. When told that his former partner had been found murdered, Scotty was visibly stunned. He insisted he hadn't spoken to Brad in months and had nothing to do with what happened. His grief and confusion appeared genuine, convincing the detectives that he wasn't involved in any way. With Scotty eliminated as a suspect, the case seemed to stall. There were no signs of forced entry, no clear motive, and no weapon. The detectives decided to canvass the neighborhood, hoping that someone might have seen or recorded something useful. That decision soon proved crucial. A neighbor living just down the street mentioned having a security camera pointed toward the road. The footage, they said, might show who had been coming and going from Brad's house that weekend. Detectives collected the video and began the slow process of reviewing hours of recordings while continuing to interview Brad's family and friends. 2 days later, during an interview with one of Brad's cousins, everything began to change. The cousin recalled that on the day Brad was killed, he had attended a small family lunch. Around 2 o'clock that afternoon, Brad mentioned that he needed to leave because someone named DJ was coming over. When pressed for details, the cousin hesitated, but eventually revealed that Brad had hinted this wasn't just any visitor. The two had been romantically involved for some time. According to the cousin, Brad had told her that DJ was married and still closeted about his sexuality. Their relationship had been on and off for years, but Brad had recently expressed frustration about keeping it a secret. He had confided that he was tired of living in the shadows and was considering telling DJ's wife the truth. The detectives leaned forward. If Brad had been seeing a married man, that could provide a powerful motive for murder. When they asked the cousin if she knew who DJ really was, she hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable. But after some reassurance and a reminder of the importance of honesty, she finally whispered the name that would change the course of the entire investigation: David Kinney. The room went silent. The same man who had called 911, who had appeared distraught at the crime scene, and who had presented himself as Brad's best friend, was now being identified as his secret lover. Detectives could hardly believe it at first. David had seemed genuinely heartbroken, a concerned friend devastated by what he had found. But if what the cousin said was true, that meant David had a powerful reason to want Brad silenced. The moment this information came to light, the case transformed overnight. Up until that point, David had been treated as a key witness. Now, he was the prime suspect. To avoid alerting him, investigators came up with a careful plan. They contacted David and explained that they needed access to his phone, supposedly to retrieve some photos from the day of the discovery that could help their case. David agreed and handed it over, unaware that the real goal was to search his data. When analysts pulled the location records from David's phone, their suspicions were confirmed. The data showed that David's phone had been at Brad's house precisely during the estimated window of the murder. Even more telling, forensic experts recovered deleted text messages that revealed the true nature of their relationship. The messages weren't just friendly, they were intimate, filled with romantic and sexual undertones. Meanwhile, the team reviewing the neighbor's surveillance footage found that David had arrived at Brad's home earlier that afternoon. Strangely, he wasn't driving his own car, but his wife's vehicle instead. The footage showed him entering the house and staying there for about 40 minutes before leaving. Hours later, the same camera captured him returning, this time in his truck, with his wife and daughter, to discover the body. It was an elaborate setup meant to mask what had really happened. With all the evidence stacking up, detectives believed they finally understood the truth. David had gone to Brad's house alone that afternoon. Something went terribly wrong, and Brad never made it out of the basement alive. Detectives decided it was time to confront David Kinney with what they had uncovered. He had played the part of the devastated friend perfectly, but the evidence painted a much darker picture. To keep him calm, they invited him to the station under the guise of a routine follow-up interview. At first, David's tone was cooperative and confident. He repeated the same version of events he'd given before, that he and his family had stopped by Brad's house to return a weed trimmer, found the back door open, and stumbled upon the horrific scene in the basement. He claimed to have no idea who would want to harm Brad, describing him as the kindest person you could ever meet. Then the detectives slowly began to shift the conversation. They mentioned that they'd spoken to several of Brad's relatives and friends. They brought up a name, DJ, and watched David closely. For a split second, his eyes flickered with surprise before he regained composure. When asked directly if he knew anyone by that name, he denied it. The investigators pressed further, revealing that they had obtained Brad's phone records and that a contact saved as DJ had been in frequent communication with him. They asked again if David knew anything about it. This time, he hesitated before admitting that Brad occasionally called him that as a nickname, but insisted it didn't mean anything. The detectives didn't let up. They revealed that Brad's cousin had identified David as the man Brad had been romantically involved with. David's posture stiffened, his face draining of color. He looked down at the table, shaking his head, and whispered, "That's not true." But as the questioning continued, his story began to crumble. After several hours, David finally admitted that he and Brad had indeed been having an affair for several years. He claimed that Sherry, his wife, had no idea about it and begged the detectives not to tell her. He said the relationship had been complicated, that Brad wanted more than he could give, that he loved Brad, but was terrified of losing his family. Even with that confession, David still denied having anything to do with the murder. He insisted that he hadn't been at Brad's house that day until he arrived with his wife and daughter. But when investigators confronted him with the cell phone data placing him there earlier in the afternoon, his confidence vanished. Now cornered by the evidence, David changed his story again. This time, he claimed that he had indeed stopped by Brad's home alone that day to talk. He said Brad was upset and had been pressuring him to tell his wife about the affair. According to David, an argument broke out. He described Brad as angry and emotional, saying that he felt threatened when Brad supposedly lunged toward him. In a panic, David said he grabbed a gun that Brad kept in the house and fired in self-defense. But the detectives didn't buy it. They knew that no gun had been found at the scene. When they reminded him of that fact, David fell silent. Forensic evidence contradicted nearly every part of his new story. The trajectory of the bullets showed that Brad had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle, and no evidence to suggest a fight had taken place. Brad had been ambushed, not attacked. The investigation also uncovered that David had deliberately staged the house to look like a burglary. Drawers were pulled out, and a few objects were knocked over, but valuables, including cash and electronics, were left untouched. It was a clumsy attempt to divert suspicion. When detectives laid all this before him, David broke down. His voice trembled as he muttered, "I didn't mean for it to happen." He claimed that Brad had threatened to reveal their affair to Sherry, and he had gone to the house that day to try to talk him out of it. He said he brought a gun only because he was scared of what Brad might do if he got angry. But according to David, when Brad started yelling and said he would tell Sherry everything, David lost control. Still, his version didn't fit the evidence. The forensic team found that Brad had been shot twice in the back of the head, both shots fired from close range. The gun was later recovered, and ballistic testing confirmed it was the weapon David owned. By the end of the interrogation, detectives had all they needed. David Kinney had gone from grieving friend to self-confessed killer. But the full story of his deception and the tragic chain of choices that led to Brad's death was only beginning to emerge. After hours of questioning and with mounting evidence against him, David Kinney was placed under arrest for the murder of Brad McGarry. The community of Bel Air, Ohio was stunned. To everyone who knew them, Brad and David had seemed inseparable. Best friends who spent holidays together, shared meals, and treated each other like family. The revelation that their friendship had been a cover for a secret affair and that it had ended in murder was almost impossible to comprehend. David's wife, Sherry, was blindsided. She had stood by him during the initial investigation, convinced that he was a grieving friend caught in the middle of a tragedy. But when police informed her of the truth, her world collapsed. She learned not only that her husband had been living a double life, but that he had taken the life of a man they both cared deeply about. As the case moved forward, prosecutors began laying out their argument. Their theory was simple but devastating. David Kinney killed Brad McGarry to protect his secret. Brad had grown tired of hiding their relationship and threatened to tell Sherry the truth. David, terrified of losing his marriage, his reputation, and his standing in their small community, decided that silencing Brad was his only way out. The prosecution believed that on the day of the murder, David went to Brad's home under the pretense of talking things through. Instead, he brought a gun and shot Brad twice in the back of the head. Afterward, he ransacked the house to make it appear like a robbery gone wrong, then left, only to return later with his wife and daughter to stage the discovery of the body. In the courtroom, David sat quietly at the defense table, avoiding eye contact with Brad's friends and family. His legal team argued that the shooting had not been planned, that it was a tragic accident. the result of an argument that spiraled out of control. They painted David as a man caught between two lives, consumed by fear and confusion. But the physical evidence told a different story. Forensic experts testified that Brad had been shot from behind at close range, execution style. Blood spatter patterns and bullet trajectory analysis proved that he had been facing away from David when he was killed. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, and no defensive wounds on Brad's body. The scene was calm, deliberate, and controlled, completely inconsistent with a fight. Detectives also presented the deleted text messages between Brad and David, which revealed the depth of their relationship and the growing tension in the days leading up to the murder. Brad's messages showed a man who was becoming increasingly frustrated and hurt. He told David that he was tired of living in secrecy and hinted that he might tell Sherry the truth if David didn't. Those messages, combined with the timing of the murder, painted a clear picture. Brad had been killed within hours of sending those final texts. The prosecution emphasized how David had gone to great lengths to manipulate the situation afterward. He returned home, gathered his wife and daughter, and drove back to Brad's house pretending to find the body for the first time. In doing so, he attempted to create an alibi and divert suspicion. Throughout the trial, the jury listened to emotional testimony from Brad's friends and family, who described him as generous, loyal, and full of life. His cousin recalled how excited he had been about planning a beach vacation with the Kinney family, unaware that the man he loved would take his life just weeks before the trip. When it was David's turn to take the stand, his demeanor was subdued. He repeated his story about self-defense, insisting that he never meant to hurt Brad. But the prosecution dismantled that claim piece by piece. They reminded the jury that Brad had been shot from behind, that the supposed weapon Brad reached for was never found, and that David had gone to great lengths to cover his tracks afterward. By the end of closing arguments, it was clear that the jury didn't believe David's story. What they saw instead was a man driven by fear and selfishness, a man who murdered his closest friend to protect a lie. After hours of deliberation, the verdict was announced: guilty of aggravated murder. When the verdict was read aloud in the courtroom, there was a heavy silence. David Kinney sat motionless, eyes fixed on the floor, as the judge confirmed what everyone already suspected. He had been found guilty of aggravated murder and of using a firearm in the commission of a felony. Across the room, members of Brad McGarry's family held hands, tears streaming down their faces. For them, the decision brought a sense of justice, but it could never bring Brad back. The sentencing hearing that followed was filled with raw emotion. Prosecutors asked for the maximum penalty, arguing that David had acted out of pure self-interest. They described the killing as cold, deliberate, and motivated by his desperate need to protect his double life. They reminded the court that Brad had trusted David completely, that he had welcomed him into his home, shared his secrets, and believed their friendship was genuine. When it was the defense's turn to speak, David's attorney pleaded for mercy, portraying him as a man who had made a terrible mistake rather than a calculated killer. They argued that he had snapped under emotional pressure, that he wasn't a danger to society, and that a life sentence without the possibility of parole would be too harsh. David himself addressed the court briefly. His voice was low and strained as he apologized to Brad's family. He said he never meant for things to go as far as they did, and that he would carry the weight of that day for the rest of his life. His words were quiet, almost rehearsed, and did little to sway the room. The judge, unmoved by his apology, delivered a firm and powerful statement before announcing the sentence. He said that Brad McGarry had been executed in his own home by someone he loved and trusted. He called the murder an act of cowardice and deceit, a calculated decision by a man who valued his own comfort more than another person's life. David Kinney was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, with an additional 3 years for the firearm charge. The judge's words were clear. This was a crime that demanded the strongest punishment available. As deputies led David from the courtroom, his wife Sherry sat in stunned silence. She had lost her husband, her family, and her sense of reality all in a single moment. The man she thought she knew was gone forever. For Brad's loved ones, it was a bittersweet victory. Justice had been served, but it offered little comfort in the face of such senseless loss. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered as family members and investigators gave brief statements. Brad's cousin spoke on behalf of the family. describing him as a loving, generous man who had wanted nothing more than to live openly and be accepted for who he was. She said that his death should serve as a reminder of how destructive secrets and fear can be. In Bel Air, the story spread quickly. It was the kind of tragedy that left the entire community shaken, a reminder that darkness can hide behind even the most familiar faces. Friends and neighbors who had once seen David and Brad laughing together at backyard barbecues struggled to reconcile those memories with the reality of what had happened. The case drew national attention, both for its shocking betrayal and for the deeper issues it represented. It wasn't just about murder, it was about secrecy, identity, and the devastating consequences of shame. Brad's friends created a memorial fund in his name, dedicating it to organizations that support LGBTQ+ youth and advocate for mental health awareness. They wanted his memory to stand for love, honesty, and the courage to live authentically. The very things he had been denied in his final days. David began serving his sentence at an Ohio state prison, where he remains to this day. In the years following the verdict, David Kinney continued to serve his life sentence in an Ohio correctional facility. His legal team filed multiple appeals, arguing procedural errors and claiming that the court had failed to properly consider his state of mind during the killing. But one by one, those appeals were denied. Judges consistently upheld the original conviction, finding that the evidence against him had been overwhelming and the jury's verdict sound. David's life behind bars has been quiet. He's largely stayed out of trouble, working occasional prison jobs and keeping to himself. In interviews with investigators and reporters over the years, he has alternated between expressing regret and trying to minimize his actions. Some who have spoken to him say he still struggles to fully accept responsibility, holding on to the claim that he never meant to hurt Brad. But for those who knew Brad McGarry, those words feel empty. The reality remains that a man who trusted him completely lost his life because of deceit and fear. For Brad's family and friends, healing has been a long process. His cousin, who first told detectives about DJ, said the most painful part was realizing how much Brad had loved someone who ultimately betrayed him. Many of his friends still gather every year on the anniversary of his death, sharing stories about his laughter, his generosity, and the joy he brought into their lives. They've chosen to remember him not for the tragedy that ended his life, but for the kindness and light he carried with him every day. Over time, Brad's case has come to symbolize something larger than the crime itself. It speaks to the hidden struggles people face, the fear of judgment, the weight of secrecy, and the damage that can come from living a double life. For investigators, it was one of those cases that lingered long after the courtroom doors closed. The betrayal at its center, between two men who were supposed to care for one another, left a mark not only on their families but on the entire community of Bel Air. Years later, true crime documentaries and podcasts would revisit the story, calling it one of the most shocking betrayals in recent Ohio history. Listeners were struck not just by the brutality of the act, but by the web of lies and emotions that led to it. Brad McGarry wasn't famous, powerful, or rich. He was an ordinary man who wanted to love freely and be accepted. His death was a tragedy born from fear, secrecy, and shame. Today, the home where Brad was killed stands as a quiet reminder of that dark chapter. Neighbors say they still think about him whenever they pass by. The laughter and warmth that once filled the house are long gone, replaced by silence, a haunting echo of a friendship destroyed by deception. In the end, David Kinney's greatest fear, that his secret would destroy his life, became a self-fulfilling prophecy. He lost everything he had tried so desperately to protect: his family, his freedom, and the trust of everyone who once cared for him. Brad's story is a painful one, but it's also a lesson about truth and the danger of hiding who we are. Secrets, no matter how well kept, have a way of surfacing, and when they do, the cost can be devastating. This case remains one of the most tragic examples of love turned deadly, a reminder that even the closest friendships can conceal unimaginable darkness.